Right now, though, I'd like to invite my colleague, Christopher Springate, who will take off where the former president has left off by asking the question or dealing with the issue of threats and opportunities of increasing isolationism to international power relations. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you, Edith. And unlike President Karzai, I love talking about politics. And thank God I managed to convince some people to pay me to talk about politics. That's what we're going to do until the lunch break. So welcome to the Global Media Forum's Foreign Policy Panel, Threats and Opportunities of Increasing Isolationism to International Power Relations.
Global inequalities, the central theme at this year's Deutsche Welle Global Media Forum. Borders, barriers, walls. They were thought to be relics of the past. Now they are staging a comeback around the world. Populist movements surge in Europe and America.
Pay for the wall!
Trade agreements are being scrapped. International institutions have come under siege. How to cope with global challenges such as climate change and mass migration under these circumstances? Does America's turn inward provide an opportunity for Europe to step into the void and take on a new set of global responsibilities? Join our discussion. Threats and opportunities of increasing isolationism to international power relations. Here at the Global Media Forum 2018.
And as ever, we have a very broad range of perspectives for this panel. Let me introduce them to you. We have from South Africa, Sean Jacobs. Could you join us, Sean? Sean is Associate Professor of International Affairs at the New School. He's also the founder and editor of Africa as a Country, which is a website that I think challenges our received wisdoms about Africa. He's also a current Ford hashtag Africa No Filter Fellow. So the view from Africa will be coming from Sean. From Russia, we have Mikhail Troitsky. He's the Dean of the MGIMO School of Government and International Affairs in Moscow. He's had a very illustrious academic career, taking him from St. Petersburg to Washington, to Oxford, to Cambridge. He's a specialist on Russian foreign policy, on US Russian relations, and particularly interesting perhaps today and in the light of what we've been seeing on the Korean Peninsula, he's a specialist in negotiation theory. So we'll be asking you about that, Mikhail. We have from the US, John Gizzi. John Gizzi is the chief political columnist and White House correspondent at the conservative news and opinion website Newsmax. And Newsmax described John as the man who knows everyone in Washington. Do you know Donald?
Yes.
We'll be asking you about that.
I talked to him 3 weeks ago Friday.
Okay, we'll be asking you about that. John can get a little bit impatient. Just a few days ago, he tweeted this: at White House, waiting for press secretary now for 30 minutes. Did she come?
Finally.
Finally, okay. We'll ask you about that as well. And last but not least, from Germany, Benedikt Franke. I'm looking around. Right behind you, okay. Benedikt Franke is the Chief Operating Officer at the Munich Security Conference. Also an illustrious academic career, taking him all over the place, including Oxford and Cambridge. He's not afraid of using Twitter to invite the French President, Emmanuel Macron, to come to the next Munich Security Conference in February and elaborate on his plans about for European defense. So, welcome, gentlemen. And I want to kind of jump in very quickly. And essentially, I want to ask you, I think, what is on the minds of many people here when they read about and listen to the news about international affairs, what is going on? We have Richard Haas, Council on Foreign Relations in the US, talking about a world in disarray. We have the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier, a few years ago saying, Die Welt ist aus den Fugen, so the world is off kilter. So I'm keen to get, from your broad range of perspectives, an idea of what you think is going on. What's your vision of what is happening to world affairs at the moment? Sean, perhaps we could get the perspective from Africa first.
I think to start off, if you're looking at what's happening, I mean, the sort of general approach of this panel is that the US is turning inward, and so is Europe with the rise of kind of populist movements, or in the case of the United States, America first. So if you look at it from Africa, for Africans in general, let me just say some numbers quickly. If you look at, for example, the United States has, I saw a number this morning, they don't have any ambassadors in 57 countries. This covers at least 3.9 billion people on the earth. So there's this withdrawal of the United States from being strategically involved in the world. And if you look specifically at Africa, the U.S.'s involvement in Africa has mainly been through kind of military operations. It hasn't been in the field of development. If you think of Europe, particularly Germany made a big announcement about a Marshall Plan. There's a lot of...
a Marshall Plan for Africa.
A Marshall Plan for Africa, but when you ask Africans about it, then there's a lot of skepticism that it's perhaps just the same kind of money under like a different name. I think what's more interesting, and I'll stop with that, is to look at what China is doing. So to redirect the conversation away from, so for Africans, I think the conversation is moving away from the involvement of the US. The US also just announced that it was scaling down military operations on the African continent. It has a base in Djibouti and then a number of other drone bases. But I think what's more interesting is what China is doing. China, in general, I can say more about that later, but the Belt and Silk plan that they're having, but also the amount of investment that they're doing on the African continent. And again, to go back to my earlier comment about embassies and ambassadorships, in the last 10 years, either the Chinese premier or senior officials have made 79 visits to at least 47 African countries. So just a contrast between those two.
So a different level of commitment. And yeah, we will be talking about China. There are, of course, many clever people who see the center of global power moving east. John, a US perspective, what is going on? Help us understand.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you all for being here. I think we're seeing a period of political change in the United States. It was less than 20 years ago, in his inaugural address to begin his second term, that President Bush called the spreading of freedom the issue of our time, the calling of our time, were his exact words. And he had embraced the vision of Nathan Sharansky and others that spreading freedom and democracy was the calling of the United States. Obviously, the U.S. is backing away from that, and I would say that probably the involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, with a price tag estimated at $72 trillion by one expert, is something that's changed attitudes in official Washington. Now, when you talk about America first, it does not mean what it meant before World War II. Is the United States completely isolated? No. And certainly the airstrikes at Syria, the involvement in the Middle East, and particularly Israel and Pakistan, and, of course, what's going on in Singapore today are examples that the U.S. is still engaged in the world. I do think that there will be less involvement. The last time I spoke to President Trump, he was highly critical of the U.S. involvement in Iraq and said, look what we got. Muqtada al-Sadr, who he considers the most evil of all, coming in first in the elections, and the warlord al-Hamri, in President Trump's words, the Iran guy, coming in second. Now, one thing I would say, there's also a greater focus in the United States on domestic issues, perhaps. And this is not uncommon. If there's an America First movement, then there's certainly an Italy first movement, as we've seen in what was yielded in the last election and the new government under Professor Conte. One could say that Brexit was a Britain first movement, or that the rise of the Alternate for Germany party, AfD, something that the punditocracy never saw coming until the end, is a Germany first movement. Historian Graham Stewart, an authority on Europe in the 1930s, agrees that we're becoming, in a sense, like the 30s, in the sense countries will concentrate more on their own problem. Does this mean the rise of dictatorship or fascism? No. That's going to be very hard to bring back in the world today. But it does mean less involvement, more skepticism about international organizations. So we could say about America first, Italy first, and the rest, what the author Mark Twain once said: history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.
Okay, well, we will be asking you more about the different nature of what you're calling America First, because, of course, many of us have forgotten that that slogan is actually an old slogan, has been used by many previous presidents decades ago. So we will delve a little bit deeper into that. I'd like to get the perspective from Russia, Michael Troitsky. What is the view of Russians and of yourself as to what is going on?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm not authorized to speak on behalf of all Russians, so let me
we hope you're not going to be speaking on authority of a government.
No.
As an academic
certainly not
authority.
of the government. But to kind of live up to my academic credentials, I would suggest we look at those changes that John just outlined from the perspective of individual leaders, and then nation states, and then the community of nations. So at the level of individual world leaders, we are witnessing more and more political entrepreneurship. There are a few leaders now in power who have won their office by taking huge risks during their campaigns, by exploiting new divides within those societies that elected those leaders. And so having been elected on such risky platforms, those leaders do not shy away from brinkmanship in foreign policy. And if we look at the domestic level, we see that those leaders respond perfectly to the new cleavages, to the new social divides that are increasingly emerging across developed nations. And there's been quite good scholarship so far done on that topic, but the point is that the traditional left-right divide is giving way to identity politics even in major nations. So those leaders jump at identity politics, exploit that agenda, and become popular. And then those publics who are keen to assert their identities easily buy into grievances and complaints and demands for justice with regards to other countries. And those leaders are happy to incite those feelings of injustice that needs to be repaired. And then they do not differentiate, like I think the US President Donald Trump, between allies, partners, rivals, just other states. If there's injustice, it had to be repaired with regards to everyone. And now at the systemic level, at the level of the community of nations, we have that diffusion of power, I think, that has already been discussed at some length here. And we see the superpowers share in the world economy decline, and maybe we are going to see even the share of China in the world economy decline pretty soon, when the rate of economic growth of China is going to go under the world's average. And we are also perhaps seeing a rise of a peer competitor, although China has still to figure out if it really has a vision of a new world order and understands how it wants to promote that alternative world order. Of course, we see all those conflicts here and there that always were the case over the last decades. But the difference between now and, say, the Cold War is that there's no lodestar, there's no collective mission for those who feel their responsibility for maintaining the world order to actually do that. There's no East-West divide, so that gives plenty of opportunities for political entrepreneurship in the international arena and in a way testing the world on what is possible and what is not.
Okay, so we have sort of a vision of US disengagement in many parts of the world, Chinese engagement, particularly in Africa, the America first, Italy first, Germany first vision of what's going on, the idea of identity politics taking over a little bit from the left-right divide, political entrepreneurship, also sort of the traditional world powers beginning to lose some of their power and it's moving elsewhere. Benedict, from the perspective of the Munich Security Conference, having listened to all the leaders who joined you in February, what kind of vision, when you hear these visions, what's your vision?
Thank you for having me. Thank you to all of you for not having run off to an early lunch. You asked, what is going on in the world? Let me make 3 points. I think a lot is going on, and it sort of confuses people. There are many largely unrelated processes that lead people to the wrong sweeping conclusions. It's nothing new that is going on, and that scares the hell out of the people that have sort of some historical knowledge. And at the end of the day, it's not as bad as it looks. Yes, we have seen a disastrous G7 summit. Yes, we have seen the systemic shock that is the wrecking ball that is Trump. But I think we're still far away from the disintegration of the West, or I still don't think we're present at the destruction, as The Economist has recently, and Foreign Affairs has recently written. On the contrary, I think that the emboldened spoilers and the increased threat level and the increased awareness of those threats is an enormous chance for the West, for Europe and for Germany in particular. The hurdles are high, but I think now is the right time to start running and take them. And so, yes, the mood at the last Munich Security Conference was incredibly gloomy. And in the past, people came to sort of reach out hands, and we've had the first real handshake between Kosovo and Serbia. And I mean, there were many instances of constructive dialogue in the last 54 years of the Munich Security Conference. This year was different. There was a gloomy feeling permeating all the halls. And I think at the end of the day, that woke people up. And I think it was a bit more than a wake-up call. It's a bit more like a heart attack. That's a lot more than a wake-up call. And it really forces you to reduce your fat intake and all the other things. You're going to be serious about this. And maybe that is the moment where Germany becomes serious about its own security and defense. Maybe that's the moment where the G6+1 sort of rethink the sort of rather laissez-faire attitude they've taken in the last couple of years. And maybe that's the moment where spoilers are declared as such, and I think we are seeing that already.
Let me ask you straight away, do you think that Europe in the European Union in its current state, which is divided, shall we say, on many issues, on many very, very important issues, is in a position to quickly respond to the demands that you and others are making on also Chancellor Merkel saying, Europe has to take its fate into its own hands. Is Europe in a position to do that in a time frame that is relevant?
I think the answer must be no. But that means, and I think a lot of people are finally realizing that the answer is an emphatic no, and that the moment has come to sort of move on. And when you look at what is being done in the field of European defense right now with PESCO, that's actually a serious initiative after years and even decades of not so serious initiatives. I think that Hillary Clinton probably would have said many things very similarly to what Trump has said, but we wouldn't have taken her seriously. The guy on the wrecking ball, you are taking him seriously, and that has really put a new dynamic into Europe, and I believe that is a good thing.
So one of the hidden opportunities, I mean, we're talking about threats and opportunities.
I don't think it's that hidden. I think it's there to grasp, and I hope that our political leaders are taking it.
It's got up and slapped us in the face. Okay. By the way, I just want to say we will be opening up for questions further along the discussion. And don't forget, we have our social media desk over there, Yakov and Michaela, who are monitoring your tweets and monitoring anything you put on the Twitter wall. That's another way of getting comments or questions to us. And just as soon as there's interesting stuff, Yakov will be waving at me and trying to get my attention. I want to pick up, John, on the America First slogan. You said it's different to what it was previously. But my question, not only to you, but to you first, is, you know, the US has oscillated between isolationism and engagement throughout history for about a century now. Is this one of the US's periodical fits of isolationism, or that would be America First, or is this America alone in the sense that Donald Trump is trying to set up a new world order based on power rather than rules?
First, I do not see it as isolation in the historic definition of the word, in the sense that the country withdraws from its alliances, withdraws from international organization or financial commitments. That's just not happening. And I'll give you an example on it. When the president had a small group of us at the White House, my question was about the continued involvement with Greece to see that its debt relief is completed, and that meant continued involvement with the International Monetary Fund, historically a bête noire of the nationalists and populist movement. And he said without hesitation, yes, we will have an announcement on the IMF. He also asked me if I was Greek too, and I says, no, I'm of Italian descent on both sides. He says, oh, we had your guy in for a visit, and we had a good time. So there is involvement in international organizations, and there's involvement in the world, as I said, certainly in the Middle East, the moving of the embassy, and in a new re-engagement with Russia, something controversial within the president's own party.
But John, is Donald Trump's vision might is right, and that's how I'm going to conduct my foreign affairs, as opposed to the rules-based order that, you know, people like Chancellor Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and so on are trying to defend?
I think that he takes problems in the world on a case-by-case basis. And again, Russia is a case in point. He has been critical of the Russian government on certain things, beginning with Ukraine, where he went farther than the previous administration did in supporting the government in Ukraine against possible future attacks. And yet at the same time, he said we want to have a better relation with Russia and perhaps bring it back into the G7. So it's case by case, and nothing is a template at all with him. I think the word to use is uncertainty. And as the author Mario Vargas Llosa once said, uncertainty is a flower whose petals have yet to be picked.
Okay. Well, I know that, I think, Michael, you've been writing about uncertainty in foreign policy as actually an opportunity when things are left uncertain. Perhaps you could also comment on that, on the state of U.S.-Russian relations. You're a specialist. But also this idea, you know, is Donald Trump forging a new world order where what counts is the weight of your economy and the weight of your military?
Yeah, from my perspective, Donald Trump clearly is testing the American power and the international institutions and norms and other players in the world arena. He apparently believes, and we now have this very popular story by, I think, the editor of The Atlantic, who managed to kind of pin down an advisor, a close advisor to Trump, and have him formulate what is called the Trump doctrine, right? And I won't repeat it here, but the point is that that America is America and everyone has to count with it, with its might. So he apparently believes he can pick fights here and there, be it North Korea, Iran, trade with allies, maybe arms control with Russia, or trying to isolate Russia, and Mexico and migration, and all of that. He apparently believes he can succeed in all of that simultaneously. I think there are, of course, limits to how many wars you can fight at the same time, unless you are smart enough to kind of shift between those wars and achieve decisive victory one by one. But even then, I think your opponents are going to figure you out. Well, that said, I think the U.S. approach to relations with Russia is one of a deal. So both President Putin and Donald Trump are on the record for liking to make deals. But they don't like deals that involve, that involve losing something, that involves giving something and not taking as much, or not taking much. And any negotiation is a give and take. So judging by this experience with the Trump-Kim meeting and the final communique that came out of that meeting, I think that tactic of making deals is being put to test, given that even the base of Donald Trump, the domestic base of Donald Trump, might be dissatisfied with what he is getting as part of a deal. So what is your take? They will say there's clearly a take for North Korea to have from this situation. Their status has been hugely elevated, but what about Donald Trump? So what is going to be your take, Donald Trump? They will ask him in your relations with Russia. So I don't expect any shifts. And then on the Russian side, we hear, basically that it's up to the United States to budge, to change its position, and to prove that it's serious about wanting an improved relationship. So I do not foresee any opening here for the time being.
Let me just pick you up also on the Trump-Kim meeting. I think I remember you telling me earlier you had a period at the MacArthur Foundation, is that right? And you're working with someone who actually had direct experience of negotiating with the North Koreans. Based on that experience that you have, perhaps you could flesh it out for us, how do you assess the deal that Donald Trump says he has with Kim Jong-un?
Well, I mean, if there's a strategic aspect to that deal, then I think, and we are here down to this level of applied analysis of the current issues, which I think we could, we could engage in it for some time, but not use all the time for that. But I think the gamble here is that North Korea is going to follow a path towards, regime change or major domestic political shifts. Because if you are the leader of North Korea, there's no way for you to open up to the world, and especially to South Korea, without risking the stability of your own regime. So we had this Gorbachev scenario that many people in Russia criticized Gorbachev for. I personally think Gorbachev did a great job opening up his country to the world, but the result of that, the logical result was, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and those who didn't want it to fall, of course, were at a dismay when it happened. So I think the calculus here is kind of the same, with North Korea gradually moving towards more and more engagement with the international community. It's going to change domestically. If there's a strategic calculus in all of that, which I really doubt. It may be just some off-the-cuff moves made by Donald Trump and his administration. And I think the Iran deal was actually premised on the same thing, on the prospect of Iran actually opening up to the world and then deciding it's going to be too costly to revert to, nuclear enrichment and to weaponizing its nuclear program. And so here we go. Iran joins the community of nations and so forth. I'm not sure whether that was really happening, and so Donald Trump has some grievances about that. But with North Korea, my take on it is that.
Okay. Let me come back to this idea about, what kind of world order Trump may be trying to forge, Benedict. Is it just US self-interest, or is it trying to forge a new way of doing business based on essentially on the inequality of foreign affairs at the moment? You know, Europe can only, in many ways, accept that the US has withdrawn from the Iran deal. Its companies need to worry about being sanctioned. That is a take it or leave it approach. Is that, do you think, sort of a power-based version of world affairs that Donald Trump is trying to establish?
Yeah, I think that the two sort of ways that you chart aren't mutually exclusionary. I mean, my Russian friend was too well-educated to quote the Trump doctrine at verbatim. It is, "We are America, bitches." That is actually what that advisor said and what was quoted in the paper yesterday. I think that is a mistaken conception of might is right. I mean, that all goes back sort of to the, Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, the Melian dialogue, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. That is, it's forgetting all about soft power. And while Trump's, hard power play may work out in places, and I think that when you look to the Korean Peninsula, you see that his sort of unconventional approach, his very direct, personal approach, his sort of power-based approach, actually can bring a new dynamic into a process that has been stagnating for years. Whether it's for the better or worse, we're yet to see. But at least there is a perceptible change. But he has, and America has lost so much clout in the world. From the shining city on the hill that we talked about earlier, from the beacon of hope. People are increasingly scared, or as you see it or saw at the G7 summit, they're beginning to ignore parts of the American agenda. And I think that's a very dangerous process, and one that will come to haunt President Trump. And I think that's one that the Europeans, if they get their act together, can use to bring him back on board. And I think he will realize, if he hasn't already done so, that the amazing power that America currently has in virtually every field, when it comes to technology, military, cultural, every field, is based on the current world order. And it is in his very interest to maintain and improve upon it. And I think that you will see that change coming.
I want to get a reaction from John in just a second to that, but my attention has been grabbed by Yakov, who has some comments or some questions via Twitter.
Yeah, comments and some thoughts, but also some questions, of course. I assume this is a question for you or our colleagues from GMF, why there are no females in a panel to discuss international power relations in a conference about global inequalities. And there's another question. Yeah, exactly. How do you conduct foreign policy with a US president whom no one can trust? We can't just wait for him to go away.
Okay. Many thanks for that. And perhaps I could, it is indeed a pity that we don't have a woman on the panel. We did originally have a lawmaker from Pakistan who is joining us, one of the youngest women lawmakers in Pakistan. Unfortunately, she was unable at the last minute to join us. We will continue to try and improve in that area. Before I get to you, John, to answer that, Sean, you have something you want to say.
Yeah. Just quickly, I think, firstly, let me also make my disclaimer that I'm not speaking for the whole of Africa, because I know that was a discussion yesterday. But I think two quick points. One is, I think we underestimate how the uncertainty or this kind of notion of kind of political entrepreneurialism in which people are sort of testing the bounds of the international order, in which it does create room for certain kinds of regimes that wouldn't have been allowed in an order where there were rules. You know, when now sort of politics is conducted on the basis of power, to try and get away with things. So you'd have, like in the Philippines or in various parts on the African continent, where leaders are either, using very strong arm illegal tactics in governing, or changing constitutions to govern in some instances, their terms would end and they would govern for another like 2 or 3 terms. And I think that's partly because there's a vacuum at the international level, at the level of superpowers, that creates that kind of opportunity. At the same time, if the argument is that you see the rise of China as kind of as an economic power, what does not happen is that the political institutions are not changing at the same level. So, for example, the way that the UN Security Council is set up, the WTO, various multilateral organizations are set up, they don't allow for that to change. So China's economic power might increase, but the organizations that make political decisions, those organizations still remain the same.
How would you change the UN Security Council?
I mean, I think the question now is to displace the power of these kind of organizations that came in after the end of the Second World War. So you are seeing kind of interstate, intergovernmental organizations emerging. BRICS is an example where you have Russia, China, India, South Africa, and Brazil try to create a sort of counterpoint to U.S. power. BRICS is kind of undergoing its own problems. But what's interesting about BRICS is that, in a way, I think China used it as a dress rehearsal for its own for projecting its own power. And the arguments around China's expansion is it's better that China does not expand its power. It doesn't show its power militarily, but rather sort of economically, politically. And as I was saying earlier, the Silk Road initiative is interesting. 68 countries. And it encompasses from Europe through Asia. It includes part of East Africa. And what's different about it is not about military, it's about infrastructure development, roads. And if you look at the involvement in Africa, the building of rail, etc. So it's not that there's going to be a different at the level of the UN, but I think mostly at a sort of regional level, supranatural level, that other forms of governance are emerging.
Okay. John, let me put Benedict's point to you, which, if I understand correctly, is that the hidden cost of Donald Trump's take it or leave it approach to foreign affairs is a loss of soft power. You've just been talking about the Chinese soft power. Will that come back to haunt President Trump within the next couple of years, perhaps?
I'm not sure, because none of us can say who the political players will be in different countries and in world powers. We are seeing, for a lot of reason, rapid change everywhere in elections. Just in this hemisphere, in the Western Hemisphere rather, Mexico and Brazil are going to have elections that will significantly affect the rest of the hemisphere and the world. Sean speaks of Africa, and we know that how the voters, the path they choose in Zimbabwe after Mugabe and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo after Kabila are going to be very key. When Chancellor Merkel criticized the president's performance at the G7, of course, Nigel Farage, someone who's been one of the most significant political players, said, she symbolizes the political class, and she won't be there for long. Now, I can't say that for a certainty. I'd like to talk to more people at this conference to get a flavor for the Chancellor's political clout. But that, it may well be you have different players. I would say within a year there'll be someone new at number 10 Downing Street. And the world is changing, so one simply can't say what the attitude will be. Well, let's reconvene in a year, see who's in power, and I'll answer your question.
Thank you for that. I'd like to open it up to the audience. We have about, we're probably going to go over, usually we should be stopping at about 1, but we're probably going to go until about 1:15. So to give space to some of your questions, we have microphones in the hall, so has anybody got a burning question that they want to ask? There's a gentleman at the back there, so microphone getting to you, and after that we have a lady over there. If you could just give your name, where you come from, perhaps your organization, and then your question.
I'm Kalinga Seniratna from Singapore, from Lotus Communication Network. Now, there was a question asked why no women in the panel. I would ask why no Asians in the panel. So let me give an Asian perspective on these issues, especially what was happening in Singapore this morning. I was just watching the press conference Donald Trump gave. Because if you look at it, a lot of the Western media narrative has been about how can you force North Korea to denuclearize. But in Asia, we didn't see it that way. We saw it as a process, and that's what has happened today in Singapore, that the process needs to include this stopping of the war games between South Korea and the US, and ultimately withdrawal of US bases from Korea. So then it will come to a stage where there is no reason North Korea should have nuclear weapons. And also what happened here was that how Trump was more or less forced into this situation to come and meet the North Korean leader. And South Korea and North Korean leaders played a very clever game in getting him to Singapore to meet together, because all what North Korea was doing with the nuclear weapon testing was North Korea to be treated equally. And that's what they have achieved. And then Trump was saying today that it's a big cost for America to have these war games. He was even giving some figures, I think. So he was basically saying it will be good for America to stop these war games on the economic front. And he was hinting of dismantling the bases. So Asia has got his point of view. But the question here is the Western media. I'm always wondering, how can you show some humility to listen to others and give their points of view more space in your media? And I'm glad RT channel is doing that very well. And in fact, I have more faith in the RT channel, especially with news of Syria and the Middle East. So I will put to you, what is stopping the American and the European media from being a bit more to show more humility and listen to others?
Thank you for that question and the perspective from Asia, and apologies again for not having an Asian panelist. Let me put that question actually to Sean, since you have a website. For the Europeans? Not speaking for the Europeans, but perhaps from the perspective of how we journalists sometimes portray these things from a heavily Western perspective. And what would you say to that? Do we need to be more regionally sensitive?
I mean, I think it's not even it's not even dependent on European journalists anymore or European broadcasters. I think the environment for the media has changed significantly. I read recently where the New York Times' India correspondent noted that the bulk of his audience wasn't people in the United States, but these were people living in India, and the way he was reporting was to become more cognizant of that he had this audience that could in real time respond to him. So my sense is that the role of the foreign correspondent, if that's what the question is about, if the question is talking about, because you have these journalists who kind of write from these places, or the pundit class, I think a lot of that's changing. I think the internet has a lot to do with it, the way that people can live stream. I mean, again, this is not overstating the role of the internet, because it comes with its own inequalities. But you can publish an opinion editorial from an Asian perspective about these negotiations, and if it gets picked up on social media, it can go viral. This does not excuse, as the questioner rightly says, this sort of Western-centric view in these media. But we should also accept that that's Western media, and Western media is reporting to its own societies. We should create our own media at the same time and trying to say, I mean, Africa as a country, for example, that project that I'm involved in outside of my sort of academic work started out as a response to these kind of negative, overdetermined reportings of Africa. But over time, we also realized that, we can't be doing that forever. We also have to enter ourselves into the debate and kind of try to change the terms of the debate.
Let me also pick up again on the Asian perspective, because I think it's interesting to talk again, and I'd like to ask you about this, John, about what has happened with Trump accepting to meet the North Korean leader. Has he not isn't one of the costs of that meeting, I mean, we all hope that it will turn out wonderfully, but isn't one of the costs of that meeting that he's essentially legitimized a strategy, get nuclear weapons, keep them, and then you get the US to the table? You know, Hamid Karzai was mentioning that in his speech, that that's the outcome of Iraq and Libya. The message to some of these leaders around the world is misbehave and I'll come and talk to you.
Tell that to a fellow by the name of Muammar Gaddafi. Now, he had his nuclear weapons. He did give them up. And at the end of, for many years, was starting to move into the responsible community of world leaders. And then, of course, we know the rest of the story. I still do believe it was a mistake that this country, along with France and the UK, overthrew Gaddafi because, as President Karzai said, look what came afterward. It was far worse. No, I don't believe that Trump was forced to the table or will give another impression of North Korea any more than I believe that Jimmy Carter, as a former president, weakened the United States when he met with the grandfather of the current South Korean leader, Kim Il-sung, in 1994, because that began a process where at least we know what the hermit looks like within the hermit kingdom. He's out and he's visible, and we're at least talking to this person who's there. And remember one other thing. President Trump, a week ago Friday, essentially called off the meeting for a while because he did not like the tone of the letter from one of Kim's closest advisors criticizing the vice president and national security advisor John Bolton. And then through back channels and other sources, including the former head of North Korean intelligence, the meeting was back on. So at that point, I don't think he lost any stature or he legitimized a country we at least know a lot more about than we did 20 years ago.
Can I put to Michal, to you as well, you know, has the US made too many concessions for not much in return?
Well, I think that's an unconventional way of handling North Korea. So the difference between this declaration that has just been issued and what we saw, what we have seen in the past, and there's a long list of similar statements made by both sides, and they are replete with commitments to denuclearize, and on the U.S. side to, you know, ensure security of North Korea and its economic survival. But the difference now is this kind of personal rapport between Kim and Donald Trump, and whether that can be used as a leverage in the future to kind of get more concessions from Kim, and in a way get him open up, get him exposed to whatever, to the outside world. So you've got that footage of Kim walking around Singapore at night, and that was also broadcast, I guess, in the North Korean media. So would that have a subversive influence in the neutral sense of the world on the North Korean regime and the ways and means that they practice? So it's highly doubtful that North Korea is just giving up its weapons anytime soon. But I think this process of engagement is something that makes this situation distinct from what we had in the past, and which was quite similar in terms of formulations in the joint communiques.
Okay, thank you. We're just going to collect a few more questions. So there was a lady over there. We have a lady here, a gentleman there, and a lady there, and a gentleman there. So we're just going to collect all of your questions in one go.
Hello, my name is Fatema Kamali. I'm an Iranian scholar. I've been 6 years a journalist in Iran, and then I came to Germany to do my PhD. I'm afraid that I want to ask again a question from Mr. John. I'm feeling a bit bad because you are here to get comments about the aspects of decisions of Mr. Donald Trump. You answered to a question that you don't think that actually it would be a full isolation for the United States as an aspect of decisions of Mr. Trump. But what do you think about the increasing hatred against the United States as a whole? I just give an example that I'm an Iranian and I'm one of the countries which has 7 countries which has a ban of entering to United States. And United States is not just a country, it's also home of a very important international organizations. And for 3 months, for example, I'm waiting for a visa to attend a conference in United Nations. And this is just one example. I have not been that much against the policies or I didn't have this bad feeling about the United States before that. But this is very, very much, this is a policy very much actually aiming the life of people in these 7 countries. I have met another journalist yesterday from Yemen, and she also had the same problem. So what do you think about the increasing hatred possibly in the Middle East?
Thank you for that question. We're going to pass the microphone on to the lady over here.
Hello. My name is Maria Jones, and I am an undergraduate student from the University of Kentucky. I've been keeping up with the news about the summit while we've been discussing here, and they were just saying that Trump was saying he expected to meet many times with Kim Jong-un in the future, and that Kim was saying that this was a good meeting and that it was historic, and they decided to leave the past behind. However, is that truly possible with 2 leaders whose isolationistic views have caused both their countries negative effects in the past few years?
Okay, thank you for that. Gentleman over here, microphone on its way to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Henry Kawe from Zambia. My question is basically focusing on the coverage of bad leaders in Africa. It seems like if a bad leader is in good books with the West, or there are certain mineral benefits that come from that country, there isn't so much coverage. I would compare Mugabe and Kabila of Congo DR. You find that there are so many refugees that are coming from Congo to Zambia at the moment, but the pressure from the international media is not as much as it was when Mugabe was violating certain rights. If you compare what is happening, it's almost similar. You know what's happening in Congo and what was happening in Zimbabwe when Mugabe was there. So how do we balance that? Is it because Kabila is in good books with the West?
Okay, thanks for that question. To be fair, I know there was there's a lady over there who's had her arm up for a long time, and then gentleman here and a gentleman here, and then we'll proceed to some answers.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Claire Adela Abdurazak. I'm from Africa's largest, most populous country, that's Nigeria. First, let me appreciate China. Within the context of our discussion, I think China is leading, other nations. China is having more engagement with particularly African countries, and in my country, China is doing quite a lot. So I really want to use the opportunity to, appreciate China in terms of engagement. But I'd like for Mr. John precisely, and probably members of the panel, to really explain to us again the concept of isolationism, whether in the historical context, or in the emerging context of Mr. Trump. I really would not know what isolationism means, from the perspective of the US. If, for instance, as someone wrote, that what is happening in the US right now is that the present administration is ramping down or ramping up military engagements, but ramping down every other thing. And what is happening in Singapore, from other perspective, is simply don't. So I'd like for you to give us your perspective. What really is isolationism within this context? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Gentleman there and gentleman there, and then we'll proceed to some answers and see how we are doing on time.
My name is Martin Jafelt. I'm a journalist from Berlin, and I mean, we all have learned now that Trump is not interested in multilateral agreements, so he's interested in deals. We all know that. But when we look at these deals, I mean, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that is not solving a conflict. That is actually deepening a conflict. Bringing an end to the Iran agreement is bringing much more uncertainty to the world. It's not solving a conflict. Choosing Saudi Arabia as the closest ally in the area is not bringing more stability to the region or to the world. It's just deepening conflicts, basically. So what are these deals all about, basically? And so I don't see this this atmosphere of confidence, which I heard from some of you, that things might move in the right direction. I mean, what's the basic results of all these decisions are that more arms can be sold all over the world by the US and by other nations as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Last but not least, for now, the gentleman in the...
My name is Anton Lysenkov, Spectre Press, an online Russian language magazine. Well, I have a broad philosophical question. Speaking of isolationism, do you view it as a kind of a reaction to globalism? And if so, how long that reaction could take? And another question is regarding Russia. As you probably would agree, the first terms of the President Putin, Russia, during those first terms, Russia was largely within the mainstream of the Western countries. It was following the suit of the West. But later, after the Munich speech, basically, we have a dramatic change, and Russia is now viewed more as an opposition to the West. In your view, how that change can be accounted for? What was the reason of that change? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to try and group those questions together as much as possible and put them to various panelists. And can I ask you to be relatively brief? Sean, let me start with you. We had a question behind me from our colleague from Zambia. Coverage of bad leaders in Africa seems to be selective. A lot of coverage of Robert Mugabe, not that much coverage of Kabila in Congo. What's your take on that?
I mean, the short answer is that there's nothing unique about that. That's kind of historically how the West has covered African leaders. I mean, it goes back to this question of what in the U.S., for example, most American journalism kind of lines up with the foreign policy objectives of the U.S. government. So within the U.S. there's kind of debate about various options on domestic policy, but when it comes to foreign policy, they line up with the American government. So if the U.S. government for a long time was sort of not sympathetic, but propping up Mobutu and say Zaire, or there's various other current leaders where they have strategic alliances, Museveni and Uganda, etc. Or, I mean, people may have noticed the only African leader that Trump has personally had a meeting with is Sisi from Egypt. I mean, he's had a luncheon with a whole bunch of other leaders. So it's obvious that nothing has really changed. I don't think there's anything unique now, maybe since Mugabe. I think it's a long history of the way that it's been covered.
It's the nature of the beast.
Yeah.
But we need to improve. Thank you for that. Let me ask Michael. We had a question from Maria Jones in Kentucky, or from Kentucky. I'm going to simplify it a bit. Can Trump and Kim get along in the long term? And let me ask you, also this idea from Martin, is Donald Trump, is his approach to multilateralism, or lack of approach, is that worsening conflicts across the world?
Well, I think that both Trump and Kim value this personal engagement, and generally I don't see why they cannot keep liaising, even keep meeting face-to-face in the future. But, of course, that relationship is going to be put to test by all sorts of pressures coming onto Donald Trump, and perhaps also on Kim, to achieve visible progress in solving the core issue that they were in Singapore for. And I'm not sure if that personal rapport can weather those kind of storms, although it will be extremely attractive for Chairman Kim to keep, talking directly to President Trump, and for North Korean officials to engage directly with high-level U.S. officials. But I think the jury is just out on whether Kim is going to make any concessions with regards to his missile and nuclear program. I would say it might all fizzle out in a few months, so to say. Mm-hmm. And with regards to isolationism and the aggravation of conflicts, well, you can make a case that if the current institutions, the existing institutions, are not effective enough to deal with those challenges that you think are acute, and of course there might be many perspectives on whether, the Iran nuclear program is a threat or a challenge, and even on North Korea, a country like Russia keeps, calm and says, well, you just talk, and apparently Russia doesn't believe that North Korea is a threat to Russia. But anyway, if those institutions don't work, and if the superpower believes they don't work, then there's this temptation to go it alone. And again, the jury is out how much weight the United States has in the world arena, and how many conflicts can it sort out at the same time. And losing its, as I think some of the members of the audience indicated, losing its soft power, soft power being drained. So how long can you go on like that is a very good question. And I don't think you can go on like that for too long.
Okay, well, that's certainly a sub-theme that we've developed this morning. Benedict, Russia, the question from our Russian colleague, what explains the Russian change of tack towards the West?
I think you mentioned the famous 2007 speech which happened at the Munich Security Conference. We haven't taken Russia seriously for too long, and it's a proud nation with a proud history, and the feeling of having their sphere of influence ignored for too long, and with Ukraine that sort of, that was the final drop in the bucket. We have to re-engage. The difficult question, and I don't have the answer, is how to re-engage. I think the sort of, open arm policy is as wrong as the full sanction policy, and we are yet to find a good way in the middle. It will be interesting to see whether the World Cup and the perception of Russia brings any change, whether there is a more constructive attitude thereafter. It'll be very interesting to see what the Russians are doing in response to the Kim-Trump summit. It'll be very interesting to see what the Russians are doing when it comes to the sort of mention of a possible reinvigoration of the G8, the re-invitation of Russia into that club. It'll be interesting to see if they are becoming more constructive. I am not a Russia expert, but there is a lot that tells me that it may not be that easy, and that we probably will not see that much change. A lot of people had placed great hope on sort of the elections, and everyone knew that Putin was going to win, but people thought, there would be a new cabinet, maybe a new prime minister, there would be a more constructive attitude. We haven't seen that as of yet. So I think the jury on that question is still out. And let me make a final point now, I have to be quick. I think the concept of isolationism, that was the wrong one for this discussion anyway, because what we're seeing is not isolationism. What we're seeing is sort of a new focus, a new self-awareness of the Americans and other countries, and I think Trump has named it the rise of the silent majority, which is a bit dramatical, but there is probably something to that. And let's forget this philosophical question about isolationism as a result of globalism, but definitely what we're seeing and what we've talked about here today is a reaction to globalism and to perception by many that they're not gaining from it.
Okay, thank you for that. So moving into some of the other questions which I'd like to put to you, John, finally. We're a bit time challenged. We had our colleague from Nigeria asking for your sort of a clearer definition of isolationism, a certain amount of confusion there. We had our scholar from Iran talking about the increasing levels of hatred leveled at the US. Let me ask you also, add my question to this. What's your view, your personal view? What kind of United States do you want? Do you want a shining city on the hill, a beacon of democracy, or are we going to see a fortress that is pulling up its drawbridge? What kind of America do you want?
Since you've got the time clock, Christopher, I'm going to answer you first, with all due respect, and then I will deal with the young lady from Iran and the lady from Nigeria momentarily. I want to see an America that's engaged but not over-involved in the world and have its resources for our children and our children's children drained now. And that means certainly being very careful about foreign involvements, as George Washington warned, respecting our neighbors and working with neighbors to deal with their neighbors who may be very hostile and want to advance a policy of hegemony, but not at the risk of American lives. You know, it's interesting, the last time the United States ever declared war with a vote of Congress was after December 7th, 1941. It's either been these resolutions from Congress or it's been, as in the Korean War, just relying on a United Nations resolution to authorize American troops to go in. I don't want to see that happen in the future. I want to see an America that's at peace, but is still, that it's a dove in terms of its relations with the world, but the best armed and toughest dove on the block. That's how I would look at America in the future. In answer to the two questions, first, to the young lady from Iran, my answer is twofold. It didn't take Donald Trump to initiate the hatred of the theocracy in Tehran toward the United States. The U.S. was being denounced as the great Satan under many previous presidents. And remember, they've clung to power for now 40 years. And yes, right. And I would just say, right, all right. What I was going to say to you was this, as one who's a strong believer in journalists from the U.S. going abroad and vice versa, let's talk afterward, because I think there's one U.S. senator in particular on the Foreign Relations Committee who might be able to help in your particular situation that's there now. And in answer to the lady from Nigeria with your question, and I will be brief, I'm going to give you a history lesson in shorthand. Isolationism in the traditional sense of the word means just what it says, a non-involved United States. And we saw this at different times in the 19th century and early 20th century. The isolationism of the 30s was a reaction to World War I and that loss of life, one of the most needless wars ever fought in history, and one that Congress would not commemorate at all on its 100th anniversary. Franklin Roosevelt wanted to quarantine and weaken Hitler early on, but he could not aid any of the allies in Europe because the Neutrality Act forbade that completely. It only took an attack on the U.S. to end that kind of isolationism. And a lot of Americans believed we shouldn't be involved in Europe. The America First Committee, which advanced uninvolvement in Europe, among its paid members were John F. Kennedy and his future brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, paid members. As for isolationism today, it's what I said it is. Skepticism about involving American lives abroad, tolerance and involvement with international organizations, but being very careful about where money is used, and engagement, but at a bit of a distance and with more care. The worst thing today would be the traditional view of isolationism, because it's going to lead to what Pope Francis called the culture of indifference, and that will only lead to some very dangerous people, some that we haven't even discussed, rising to political power. Thank you very much, and Madam, I will talk to you later on that.
Indeed, that's one of the strong points of the GMF. We bring you together to talk to each other. Don't forget, he knows everyone in Washington. So I invite you indeed to I invite you to chat to John and to all panelists after this. We've now gone over time quite a bit, and a lot of people, I think, are hungry. I just have a couple of announcements to make in a second, but please give a hand to Benedict, John, Michael, and Sean. And sorry for going over time. Just a couple of announcements. Unfortunately, we've had a cancellation. The German-Iranian writer Navid Kamani is not going to be able to join us this afternoon at 4 p.m. Our Director General, Peter Limburg, was going to interview him, so unfortunately that is not going to be happening. Instead, though, Peter Limburg, our Director General, is going to answer any questions that you have about DW, so everything you always wanted to know about DW but were afraid to ask. You can ask Peter Limburg, our Director General. That is from 4 p.m. for about half an hour in the room Addis Abeba 1 and 2, which is just straight down that way. And the other announcement I have, if you do go straight down that way, you'll go through a tunnel, and there's an exhibition of photographs there by Johnny Miller, a photographer, who uses drone photography to portray inequality. Some very fascinating perspectives. I urge you to have a look at that exhibition. And Johnny Miller himself, very interesting. You can meet him at 3:30 p.m. at that exhibition today. He's also the founder of African Drone, so an interesting moment. Sorry for going over time. Thank you very much for your contributions and for your attention. Enjoy your lunch. Thank you, Sean.